Our power grid is the linchpin that keeps our modern way of life running. Without it, other utilities like water and natural gas will eventually fail also. The same goes for our transportation infrastructure that allows us to travel as well as receive goods from across the country or world. Unfortunately, our power grid is susceptible to a wide range of natural and man-made threats. This video will cover these threats along with some ways that you can be more prepared for both small-scale power outages and a total grid collapse. One of the biggest reasons that our power grid could collapse is that it's aging, and a lot of it is not being properly maintained. To put things in perspective as far as age goes, 70% of our power grid is at least 25 years old, and over a quarter of our power grid is at least 50 years old. A recent example of poor grid maintenance is the widespread power outages that resulted from the 2021 Texas ice storm. These outages were made worse because known problems and vulnerabilities, specifically those involving extreme cold, were not addressed. At one point, the Texas power grid was only 4 minutes and 37 seconds away from a total collapse, which would have put millions of people without power for months. And the Texas grid isn't the only one with problems. While extreme cold turned out to be its Achilles heel, the West Coast is vulnerable to things like drought, extreme heat, and wildfires. And like many parts of the Texas grid, the East Coast is vulnerable to things like hurricanes and other severe storms. And these issues are very well known, but they remain unaddressed because of the high cost of fixing them. So usually what we have happen after a natural disaster is people are all upset because they lost power for a while, the governor or somebody else fires a bunch of people, and the politicians say, we'll fix it for next time. But then they don't. Once people forget about the thing and they go back to their lives, then maybe a few things are fixed here and there, but the grid is still largely in the condition that it was in before. And to make these problems worse, many components of our electrical infrastructure are not produced domestically. Probably the biggest example of that would be large electrical transformers like what you would find in substations. From the time when the order is placed for one to the time it's actually on the ground where it needs to be ready to get installed, a lot of the times that can take 12 months or more. And these issues are the foundation that will make the rest of these situations much worse if or when they occur. The most common threats to our power grid come from severe weather and natural disasters. Tornadoes and severe thunderstorms are a big concern where I live, but those types of situations usually only affect a relatively small area. Sometimes you have a tornado that carves out a path 50 miles long, but other types of natural disasters like hurricanes, wildfires, and earthquakes can cause damage on a much larger scale. And the more that gets damaged, the longer that it's going to take to fix. And if you live in a rural area, it's important to understand that you will likely be waiting longer to get your power restored, because a lot of times the vast majority of manpower and resources are devoted to getting major population centers and industrial areas up and running again. I know people that live about 2 hours north of the city of Beaumont, which of course is a major port. They went, I think it was 3 weeks without power after Hurricane Ike, because a lot of the repair folks were sent down to Houston and Beaumont to get them up and running again, and the people in that part of the state were just waiting until all that was taken care of. And also other things like droughts can cause issues as well. Drought conditions have been so bad this year that the Hoover Dam's power generating capacity has almost been cut in half. No water means no hydroelectric power. And it's important to understand that all kinds of power generation are going to be vulnerable to at least one kind of natural disaster, probably more. And even if a power plant or solar panels or wind turbines are able to avoid getting damaged, then other areas of that electrical infrastructure, things like transmission lines and substations, they are still going to be vulnerable. A major pandemic, worse than the one that we've been dealing with the past couple of years, could also cause the power grid to collapse. Our electrical infrastructure requires an army of specially trained operators and technicians to keep it up and running. Working in these positions can require months or even years of training, so replacing them could be extremely difficult. If enough of these people were to become sick and unable to work, we may not have enough people to perform maintenance and repairs or even run certain facilities. And even if the workers themselves avoid getting sick, they might see those around them becoming ill, and if it is severe enough, they might decide that working is not worth the risk. Another major and growing threat to the power grid is cyber attacks. These could be done by individuals, groups, or nations, and they can result in minor disruptions or in extreme cases could even shut down entire grids. Several years ago, National Geographic put out a very good docudrama called American Blackout. The premise of it was there was a cyber attack that knocked out the West Coast Texas and East Coast power grids. So all of the continental United States was experiencing a blackout at the same time. And it did a very good job showing how different people within the American populace would handle that type of situation. I strongly recommend watching it. I'll be sure to put a link down in the description below if y'all want to get yourself a copy of that. Cyber attacks can also affect other areas of our infrastructure. Water and natural gas utilities rely on computer systems to operate, giving them many of the same vulnerabilities that our electrical grid has when it comes to cyber attacks. And cyber attacks can affect more than just various types of utilities. Of course, it could go after banking. It could go after individual companies with the goal of knocking them off their feet or stealing the financial information of their customers. And aside from cyber attacks, our power grid is vulnerable to physical attacks as well. The vast majority of our electrical infrastructure, everything from transmission lines to substations, have very little, if any, security. So it wouldn't be that hard for somebody with bad intentions to severely damage that equipment if they wanted to, and many times all they'd have to do is just walk right up to it. I know that where I'm sitting right now, there is a substation about 2 or 3 minutes that way and another one about 5 minutes that way, and both of them, the only thing that's really protecting them is a fence with barbed wire at the top. So it wouldn't be that hard for somebody to mess stuff up if they really wanted to. And this happened in 2013 where a group of gunmen opened fire on electrical transformers, the big ones at a substation, with the intention of knocking that substation out. And unfortunately, there's very little preventing something like that from happening again. And on a larger scale, war could also cause the power grid to collapse. And the bad thing about war is that nowadays it's probably going to involve both cyber attacks as well as physical attacks on things like power plants and other parts of that infrastructure. So you will be dealing with all of the issues that would come with cyber attacks as well as physical attacks, which could make it take a very long time to get everything back up and running again, if ever. And while conventional wars can absolutely devastate a power grid, an electromagnetic pulse could cause even more damage. These could happen as a result of a high-altitude nuclear detonation or a natural event such as a coronal mass ejection. A man-made electromagnetic pulse would likely immediately precede nuclear strikes on ground targets and would have very little, if any, warning. Coronal mass ejections are solar phenomena, and most of them are harmless, but one big enough could have a similar effect to that of a high-altitude nuclear detonation. And while we haven't experienced widespread damage from an EMP in modern times, there are some events that we can look at that would give us a good idea of how one would affect our modern infrastructure and electronics today. The Carrington event in 1859 was the most severe geomagnetic storm that humans have ever observed and was caused by a massive coronal mass ejection from the sun. It resulted in auroras being seen in places such as Colombia and Hawaii, and it also wreaked havoc on the telegraph systems being used at the time. Telegraph lines acted as massive antennas which picked up that electrical energy produced by the CME, and some even caught on fire. There were even instances of telegraph workers being shocked at their workstation when that electrical energy reached them. Since modern power lines are pretty similar to telegraph lines, we know that they would serve a similar function if we were to experience an EMP today. They, along with anything hooked up to them, including transformers, would likely be severely damaged. Fires would be widespread as massive power surges and electrical fires happened around transmission lines and substations, and even things like houses would catch on fire, and wildfires would result in remote areas from fires coming from those transmission lines. Now, there is some debate on the effects that an EMP would have on small electronics and other devices, and the full effects of an EMP would be better covered in its own video, and I plan to do that at a later date. Now, when actually preparing for a grid collapse, the good news is that a lot of the stuff that you would need for a total grid collapse are some of the same things that you would need for just an overnight power outage. Something like a good solar generator, the power station and panels, used in conjunction with rechargeable batteries, can be used to keep small electronics running almost indefinitely. Now, if you're concerned about an EMP happening, then of course you are going to need to think about how are you going to protect those devices so that you can use them after an EMP occurs. You're going to need something like a Faraday cage, Faraday bags, whatever the case may be to protect those. If you're concerned about an EMP, it wouldn't hurt to have some primitive lighting methods, things like oil lamps, because, I mean, you don't need electricity for those. They've been used for centuries. Now, of course, the downside to those is the risk of fire, so you want to make sure that you have plenty of fire extinguishers, or maybe throw a battery-operated carbon monoxide detector and some smoke alarms in your Faraday cage or whatever you have so that those are protected. You also want to have ways that you can purify water without the use of electricity. Gravity filters like those made by Berkey and Alexapure are good options, but if you can't afford those, then it is possible to rig up other filters like some made by Sawyer as gravity filters if you have the right connections. And you also want to have multiple ways that you can cook off-grid. Things like propane stoves and butane stoves are good for short to mid-term events, but it's important to understand that if something lasts long enough, eventually you're going to run out of fuel for those. So you want to have some things like rocket stoves, maybe a Kelly kettle that use readily available natural material biomass that you can find just laying out anywhere so you can cook and boil water in more long-term situations. And then, of course, defense is going to be a big concern if the entire grid collapses. But really, y'all, the topic of a total grid collapse and how to prepare for it could be a 2-hour video. So what I went ahead and did is I made a playlist of all the videos that I've done recently and a little while back that could be used in that situation for things like food storage, water purification, defense, all those kind of things. And you can find that playlist by clicking up there. Y'all have a good one. Thanks again.